Hey, welcome back, Golden Bears, for Module 7-2. I hope you're well today. Today we're going to be talking about progressive political reforms. And in the last time we talked about how progressives were working on the social aspects of most of America. Today we're going to focus on how the different presidents and their Congresses begin to seek ways in which to change how the landscape of America looked. But before we do that, we need to recognize that the roles of women continually are being championed. Here you see a quote: "We intend simply to be ourselves, not just our little female selves, but our whole big human selves." And so Mary Jenny Howe, she is a minister who is, and that date is incorrect, but she is one advocating for some major change that the women's groups should be advocating for. But on that note, I have, again, a funny story to tell you that kind of corresponds to this picture that you see here. A bunch of kind of Teddy Roosevelt in the front left there, and you see mirrored there with the cool beard in the middle. This tree here, it represents a grand sequoia. And back when I had hair and back when I had energy, for 4 summers, I used to go work at a Christian camp up in the Santa Cruz Mountains there. It was just a great place and a great memory for me, and that's eventually where I met my wife. But my job, my first summer there, I was worked with junior hires, and every Thursday, I think it was, we would take the junior hires from this camp and go for a walk along the railroad tracks down to this state park called Henry Cowell State Park. And there was a tree, it was a huge grove of redwoods, and one particular tree had been struck by lightning, and it had been hollowed out by fire at the base of it. And it was so big inside the tree that there was one time that we were able to get, I believe, 32 junior hires, including me, inside this tree. It was kind of a cool experience for me to still think about. And then we would then take the junior hires and then ask them, okay, now grab hand to hand or wrist to wrist if you feel awkward, how junior hires are, and we're going to see how many of it takes for us to stretch around these trees. And then when they were all circled up, I'd say, okay, now everybody look up, and they would all look up, and they just see the immenseness both in the girth and in the height of these trees, and it really basically helps you feel rather small and insignificant when you look up through the canopy of things, and kind of helps you gain a better perspective of things. But we're going to talk about that and how the government begins going on an environmental approach to this under Teddy Roosevelt and his sidekicks there. So I won't steal too much away from that. I'll save that for the next part of the lecture. Today we're going to talk about how the progressives, as I talked about in the last lecture, begin turning to professional experts, like not just elected officials anymore, but we need actually city officials who are trained as treasury experts or accounting experts or city planners to be people who will govern more efficiently than what has done in the past. We're going to talk about how the progressives are debating what we should do in terms of which people groups should we let in or not, and basically how there were some prejudices in what they opted not to do, how the progressives opted for amendments to the Constitution to bring about more equality and to support their ideals, and then the idea of national parks and Pinchot and Muir and the government's role within that. So our story begins today with immigrants and how they're facing continued challenges as cities keep swelling. If you remember in a prior lecture about, in America in 1880, there was less than 20% of the population lived in the cities. By the time we get to 1900, we're at almost 38%. Now by 1910, 2/3 of the people that are living in the cities are now foreign born, or at least have one parent who is an immigrant. An incredible amount of shift of people groups moving in the area. You have on the East Coast Ellis Island that is bringing in all sorts of Europeans by the hundreds of thousands, and ironically, and part of the continued nativism and the racism that America was experiencing and had been supporting, laws had passed that made it really relatively easy for people coming from Europe to come into America. But if you arrived to San Francisco and were Japanese of descent, or if you were Chinese descent, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and a few other acts, Often when you came to Angel Island, it was not uncommon over 50,000 people would be housed on this island for 2 to 3 years at a time while they were verifying and making sure there were family members living in San Francisco before you could make it off the island. So you need to recognize that there was duplicity about those different people groups who were coming in. There was a thing called this Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and I'm going to go to this picture here, that really raised awareness to the progressive. Remember, progressives were predominantly the middle class. And these progressives were trying to reform things at the top by changing the laws, but they were also trying to reform things at the bottom in a very meaningful way. Well, the Shirtwaist Factory basically made, what do you call it, for welders, think of them as like aprons, and they would use these aprons during their heavy industry type of welding and other steelwork projects. It was not uncommon for this factory to work with nothing but immigrant girls, and what had happened is a fire broke out on one of the lower floors, and it's a 5-story building. And because alleged theft in prior months, whenever the city officials would send to go and see if all of the fire escapes were viable and open, they would be warned, the owners would be warned by some other inside, bribery official, that they would show up. They would then take the chains off the doors, and then the fire people would say, yeah, everything's in good shape here. The moment they left, they would chain the doors. And so what happened then, a fire breaks out in the textile part of it, and this entraps, hundreds of people. Very few got out. And what happened within an hour or two is over 140 plus women had either suffocated to death due to smoke inhalation, or there were actually women who were jumping out of windows onto the street below. And what did this do? This raised the ire or the frustration point, obviously, of Americans across the landscape, but also to the immigrant nations saying, wait a minute, how is it that this could happen to so many? I mean, these were girls who were 14, 15, all the way up to 20, 21 years of age. This is not possible, and or shouldn't be possible. And so we need dramatic reforms to that. And so the Shirtwaist Factory, you need to be aware of that and how that is something that we highlight during this time period as an important event that begins causing the politicians to begin making changes to items. Take a look at this distribution of immigrants across the landscape of America. The purple is where very few of them ever went. And notice those predominantly are in the South. Why is that? Well, nativism and racism, but also the types of farming that goes on there is predominantly cotton or tobacco. There's very few people that are coming from Europe or other areas that, one, have not an interest, but two, have an understanding of that, or three, that want to get involved with that. So there was a lot of aspects that didn't move them to that. Where you'll find the bulk of them is, look at the red areas on the maps. You'll see many of them staying along the areas that are closest to them. In Florida, you have a huge segment of population coming up from the Mediterranean. I'm sorry, how come I'm trying to blank? The Caribbean region. Then you have along Mexico, you see 3 pockets of centers there. Then you have ironically up in Minnesota, North Dakota, and Wisconsin. That's where our famous, Swedish and Dutch, Sven and Ole come from and have landed there. Why? Because farming and agriculture is part of their traditions. And then behind my bald head, I'll move this way, opposite direction there. You see up in Michigan and Massachusetts, you see other huge pockets in the whole metropolitan area there of immigrants that have moved to those areas. Why are these settlement patterns happening this way? Well, they go to areas that are viable for them, but they also go where other immigrants have lived prior to them and kind of giving them access to new areas. The second thing we need to talk about is how this reform movement of the progressives really captured the mindset of municipal and state reforms. If you remember in prior lecture, I talked about how very little change was taking place in the South since the Reconstruction. Why? Because they passed laws that prevented the African American vote from ever being tabulated. They had the poll taxes going on. They had to do a written type of test in order to do things, and often violence was used to keep them from the local elections. Well, what was taking place is to fight the boss Tweeds, to fight the Tammany Hall that we talked about in prior lectures, you begin seeing municipal and state reforms taking shape to work against the corruption and the graft that was there. For instance, instead of having mayors running everything, they put commissioners in charge. Now, we're like, what is a commissioner? Well, if you follow the NFL, you follow the NBA, you follow the ML, Major League Baseball, all of them have a commissioner. And the commissioner's job is to hopefully be fair and equitable to the players and the owners, but they're also nonprofits. And as so, they're supposed to follow the rules regulated in by both the federal and state governments. The ultimate job is to make sure that the commissioners are doing things as though keeping the company in profit, but they're also meant to make sure that following all the rules as well. And so various times across all, excuse me as I turn down the volume on my thing here, as cities began turning away from just mayors and their elected officials running things to where close to 400 commissions across the nations had started in order to begin kind of covering and monitoring things. This was a huge shift that came about simply because of the progressive movement. One such person to do this was La Follette. Here he was, there were numerous mayors that had done this. There's 3 or 4 of them that are quite essential that had 10 years of over 6 years. And what did they champion? They championed less hours for workers. They were in favor of unions. They in favor of the less work on the weekend. Quite a few reforms they were keen on. But the key person is Robert La Follette. And I wish I was more organized. I have a great picture of him. You need to go look him up. La Follette has hair that makes me jealous. It like sits up here like a rooster hair. It's such a beautiful thing. But as a Republican governor of Wisconsin for his 6-year term, he instituted these range of reforms that even captured the hearts and mindset of those in Massachusetts who are typically leading the changes of reforms. What were some of the things that he did? Is he said, there need to be direct primaries and statewide. He expanded the role of civil servants, meaning let's just not have commissioners do this. Let's hire people who are trained post-college or before college just for specific tasks, so that way we get better service out of them. He said no longer can major corporations control or influence politics by giving directly to politicians. The key, and he controlled regulation of the railroad, which is a huge thing. We'll talk about that here momentarily. But he also argued for the graduated income tax that will come pass here pretty soon as well. We'll talk about this. These platforms were very, very important because this really went on to a national level when he continued to advocate for it as a senator. And in 1913, the 17th Amendment, remember, you have to hopefully bear in mind, hear this numerous times. This progressive era, there are more changes to our Constitution during this time ever since Lincoln and the end of the Civil War. Remember, you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Man, during this time of the progressives, we see 5 different amendments to our Constitution, simply because of these reforms and the progressives start striving for. So go back and do a little case study to say, wow, look at all the different changes that are happening in this Constitution. You have to ask yourself, why is that? Well, because our government has been inefficient to this point and the people are demanding changes. And so here's another example, the 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913. What does this do? It basically says senators are no longer chosen and selected by the president or the senators. They have to be elected into office. And this is a big sway because it took away the money from the politics and actually began having them represent more of the people. And moving on. The next topic that I think I get kind of excited about because I love the outdoors is this idea of how does America use one of its biggest resources, and that is our land. And within our land we have water, we have oil, we have natural gas, we have the trees, the timber, etc. And so America has to make the choice. Do we go on this road of conservation, which basically means let's maintain this wealth, meaning let's say if we have a huge forested area, that we're going to cut parts of the forest down. But in turn, the company that has been given that contract, their job is to reforest those sections and they have to keep doing that so that way it keeps cycling through, so that every 30 years they're going to be going back and then cutting down stuff that they had just planted 30 years prior. So that's called conservationism. Well, preservation is simply exclusive, meaning let's keep nature in its pristine self, and we should never have access to it because it gives undue influence to various corporations over the small person who is there to kind of be the farmer, etc. Well, what you have is Pinchot is kind of given the head of Department of Agriculture, and normally this isn't that big of an issue, but Americans in the progressive movement is beginning to recognize is that large companies want access to the oil. Large companies want access to this timber. Large companies want access to parts of Alaska, for instance, because this is going to be crucial to their growth. And so there's a lot of competition, a lot of influence tried to put on our government in terms of making a decision. For instance, the great 1906 earthquake in San Francisco really created a major problem. There wasn't enough water for them to put out the fire, let alone electricity, etc. And so what was the proposition? Is that the conservationists wanted to build an actual tunnel 250 some miles long, seriously, to go all the way from just about 5 miles if you're by a bird. 5 miles north of Yosemite is this place called Hetch Hetchy, and it is, some say it was a valley even more pristine and more beautiful than Yosemite. If you've been to Yosemite, you know there's 3 major falls that are there and just a gorgeous floor that you can walk on with beautiful idyllic streams, etc. Can you imagine just 5 miles north of that by a crow or a bird, you have something even more so. Well, what they tried to do is to make sure the city of San Francisco and other cities along the Bay Area always had water and electricity. They opted to try and dam that area up. And what did this do? This created a tension point. Pinchot, he supported the project because he saw it's the best use of natural resources, electricity and water for all of San Francisco and the Bay Area. But John Muir, who was a preservationist, said, no, this is taking away the livelihood and the land of a group of, give me a moment, the Mono Indians, and it's their land, and we need to protect their rights. And so he was a preservationist. Well, after 6 years of going to court, you might guess what won out is the conservationists and Pinchot and America's choice under Teddy, soon to be elected president, Teddy Roosevelt, and their approach is that we're going to manage these resources we have, but we're going to give access to Americans to help America continue to grow in that way. Now, I'm not here to tell you good or bad or indifferent, but that tube, it's almost 18 feet in diameter, still to this day brings water to San Francisco, some 100 and some years later. So it's quite an interesting thing. And in fact, most of that tube, if you were to go visit Stanford, it goes underneath Stanford University into a reservoir right above that. I just share that with you as just a freebie. You don't even have to pay me for that. So as again, I just showed you a picture of these men who were standing at these trees of redwoods. Is it best to cut these down and use the lumber to rebuild what city? San Francisco, which was just over the hill, or do we keep them for future legacies? And I could imagine at the time, if I lived in 1906, I'd be like, well, yeah, maybe we need to cut these things down in order to build. But having been there with the junior hires, and now I run through them, I bike through them, I trail through them, I do all sorts of things. I'm grateful to see those things just, about less than, literally there's 100 yards from my wife's front yard are these types of trees when I go up to visit her parents and such. So what we need to recognize is that America, and under the tutelage eventually of Teddy Roosevelt, begins making choices of how can we create open and public spaces for Americans and set aside these lands and forests and manage them under conservation. So you need to keep that correct, or at least clarify. Conservation versus preservation. And conservation is Pinchot, and preservation is John Muir. Now, interestingly, well, I don't want to get into that whole debate. I'll talk about that when we get to, Steger Solar. Hey, the fourth thing during this time period, and a name that comes back, is Teddy Roosevelt and this thing of the square deal. Teddy Roosevelt, some say, was born with a silver spoon. He comes from a wealthy family, went off to Harvard. After Harvard, he joins in this fight called, in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. We'll talk about that in another thing, but you need to recognize that puts him firmly fixed into becoming rather famous for what he had done during this time. He then goes on and begins working and revealing, kind of like, if you remember Jacob Riis taking pictures of the tenement houses in New York. He becomes a commissioner of that, finds out, he gets famous doing that. Then he becomes elected governor of New York, and then eventually picked or chosen as McKinley's vice president. Well, interestingly enough, why did McKinley choose him? Because he would help carry the voters for New York, and because of his liberal approach to various things and progressive approach to things. Well, McKinley gets assassinated, thus thrusting Roosevelt into this situation to begin launching things that he firmly believed about, that McKinley and his party didn't even care for. Well, what did this create? It is a new sense of a president. Now, for the first time ever since Abraham Lincoln, have we not seen a president who now wants to accelerate and put on display the power of the president? Okay, remember, the first president to show his power was George Washington, but thankfully he gave that up and passed that on the mantle. The next one that showed their power was Andrew Jackson. I'm drawing in some names here. Then we had Abraham Lincoln, who displayed the power of the president. And then since then, it's just been a bunch of presidents that did whatever the big businesses want. Now Teddy comes along. And Teddy is putting his foot and his eventual club right there in the sand, and he's saying, no, no, no more. Now, what made Teddy so unique is that he had an engaging personality, a big winsome smile, and he told stories, and he appealed to the American people. And as a result of this, many began to laud and support his programs. The second thing that he did is he said, it's time for us to give American people a square deal. And so what he began attacking and creating are economic and political programs that would bring about empowering his role as president and demoting the role and influence of the political machines and also the major industries, the major railroad companies, etc., etc. So I'm going to tell you just one example of what he had done. There were a bunch of coal miners. I believe it was I'm drawing a blank. Let's just say West Virginia, okay? And they were trying to unionize, and they were going on strike. And what had happened is the owner of that, why were they going on strike? For the basic stuff of, more pay, less hours, and basically health type care for themselves. What did the owner do? He brought in scabs, and he said, I'm going to give you none of that type of thing. So Roosevelt believed that the actions of this owner were wrong. And so he did something no president had done at that point. He basically picked up the phone and he said, owner, I forget the guy's name all of a sudden. I said, hey, owner, here's the deal. You can give in to the increase their pay and lower their hours, and then I'm going to call them and say, hey, he's going to give you these two things, and in return you just can't unionize. What do you think on that? The owner says, no, I don't like that plan. I'm going to give them nothing. So then the president says, okay, I gave you choices. If you don't want to do that, guess what? I'm going to send in the troops, and I'm going to take ownership of all of your mines and all of your trains that you own. And guess what? You'll have nothing left. And so because of this power play, the owner says, okay, fine, I guess I better start listening to what the president wants. And so this was a first step where you begin seeing the president trying to pick and choose which trusts were bad and which trusts were good. And this is the irony of it, is that it was kind of up to the whim of the president. If the railroads were good, which he labeled them all as bad, but if you were for sports, he thought those were good. He also began going on a bunch of things where he started starting different government agencies. One such agency are reforms that brought about the care of meat inspection, or the drugs that were being created, or the different foods that were being produced. Because, for instance, there were milk producers who were creating powdered milk, which was often how it was done for the cities there, and the mothers would then add water to it, and then the kids would drink the milk. There was some people who were doing stuff illegally. They were putting like arsenic in the milk, powdered milk, because it was a cheap filler, and kids were dying as a result of this type of thing. There were, again, Jacob Riis was taking pictures. You have Upton Sinclair riding the jungle and exposing issues with the meatpacking scenarios. You had Frank Norris and talking about the octopus and the power that the trains had and the illegal practices they were doing. All with this, you see the power of the president is about trying to bring about change for the American people. So here's an example of the jungle and pictures of that, and how a lot of this tainted and nasty food that had turned bad were made into sausages and sold, and just kind of a gross thing. And so you can see that the government is responding to the needs of the American people by creating new programs that still to this day are used to make sure that you and I are safe. Now there comes a time when this progressivism is going to kind of take a back seat. It's called the pendulum is swinging. And you need to be mindful that that pendulum will swing in this time period quite a bit, especially if we're talking about the Gilded Age, where there was no government intervention, and now we see tons of government. You can see the pendulum swung this way. Well, we're going to retreat backward a little bit from that. What causes us to retreat? Well, Roosevelt doesn't want to run for president again, and who does he kind of select? Well, big burly fat boy William Taft comes in, and many people thought that Taft would just continue the policies of Teddy Roosevelt, but frankly, what he didn't do is to go and attack very hard as Roosevelt thought, the continuation of attacking these trusts and the large companies, etc. And he also allowed tariffs to come back into things, and Roosevelt was against tariffs because it kept importation prices and other things being fair and balanced, and often hurt the farmers. And so with this, it created a problem. But the true problem happened is when Taft fired Pinchot. Remember, he was the one that agreed to allow conservation of various lands, etc. And this kind of angered Taft in such a way that he decided to kind of run for president. And what did this do? This run for president, it caused a division with the Republican Party. And he called it the New Progressive Party. But his platform carried a lot of the similar things as another president that was going to be running, which I'll talk about here in the next slide. But what was this new platform that Roosevelt was trying to start? It was this called New Nationalism. Now, these are platforms that we learned about with the populists in the Omaha. Quite a few of them were found there, but for farmers. Then we have going to the progressives in the early things. These platforms continue on and on, but the interesting thing you need to recognize is here they've added women's suffrage and the right to vote, but there aren't anything about race in that situation. That's a whole other ballgame that we can talk about. Well, the Democratic nominee is this geeky college professor who went to Princeton, but who was born in the South. And this, what essentially happens is because you have Taft running on the Republican ticket, and because you have Roosevelt running on this new progressive ticket, that splits the vote between the Republicans and the progressives who kind of like those ideas, and that allows Woodrow Wilson to kind of come in with his new ideas of freedom and social reforms that was even more moderate than what Taft and what Roosevelt were arguing for. What does this create? Well, kind of a retreat from this staunch changes of progressivism, but there was some degree of fair and balance between it. Wilson did want to continue to remain keeping the presidency and strong and in his hands, and so he began passing various things. Again, a 16th Amendment making the income tax constitutional. He asked for banking reforms and the creation of the Federal Reserve System, things that we still use today to give everybody access to the same amount of money that was very difficult in time period 6 that we talked about. Remember the William Jennings Bryan and the cross of gold and the 16-to-1 ratio of silver to gold, etc. Wilson was listening to the pleas of the farmers and kind of forcing the industrialists to begin sharing this money across the way. Here you have Woodrow Wilson and his tall, geeky self coming down off of his lectern, and he has his teacher's ruling stick there, and he's kind of beating people, politicians into submission, saying, this is how it will now work in America. So Woodrow Wilson and his newfound freedoms continue to begin revealing with this new government agency called the Federal Trade Commission, to begin unpacking how corporations were doing things illegally and doing behind the scenes trading, so that way other companies couldn't compete. And so it was a very unique time that, even though the pendulum had swung back a little ways as far as how Roosevelt wanted it to go, you at least still see Woodrow Wilson attacking government corruption, attacking corporate corruption, and trying to do the platforms that they had sought. Now look at these cool things that he had accomplished that were very similar to Roosevelt's. Why? Because he's trying to gain the vote and gets himself reelected. He gets the 8-hour workday and overtime pay for railroaders. He gets the child labor laws changed. He gets the workman's comp to give them insurance if they get injured. What happens to this? Wilson wins the election and continues this kind of progressive legacy where we balance government action and making attacks on corporations, or making attacks on areas that aren't effective, and helping this social justice to move through. But the drawback that you begin recognizing is that this is for just the typical white Americans. This wasn't for the African American community, that they didn't experience any benefits of this progressive movement. The Native American Indians did not. Many of the immigrants did not. And so, this progressive era for many might have just maintained more continuity than change in some people groups than others that we would like. So to conclude, we need to recognize that the progressive era did bring about some changes with local activism and government legislation, but we need to recognize that not all people groups benefited by that, and that we can actually look back to prior movements like the populists that brought about greater change than these here under the progressives, with the exception of what I said earlier, how many amendments to the Constitution were made during this time. So with that, be good, Golden Bears, and take care of each other.